When I started playing jazz, then I came from improvising mostly with the pentatonic scale, playing phrases and licks in the scale without really worrying about what I was playing and especially what notes I was playing. Once I got interested in jazz, then I realized that I needed to use 7-note scales, and that was a lot more tricky to get to sound right, and especially to get to sound like great jazz lines. Just practicing the scale up and down doesn't teach you how to do that, and there is a much better way to practice the scales, one that's going to help you learn to play jazz faster. My name is Larsen. Learn jazz, make music. First, you need to figure out which scales do you need to practice. Playing jazz is associated with scales and often also with a lot of scales with a lot of fancy names. But when you start out, then you're better off not drowning yourselves in different scales simply because it's a lot more work to learn to use a scale than it is to just play it. Just start with a major scale, and if you're new to major scales, then start with a single position. Knowing the scale well in one position will help you learn the others as well. Starting with 5 or 7 positions in one go and trying to be able to play and improvise with all of them is not as efficient in the beginning, and you might get overwhelmed and lose the overview. And getting an overview is why you practice scales in the first place. If you practice in the way that I outline later in this video, then learning other scales and being able to use them will become a lot easier because you can leverage what you already know. I have a video that breaks down which scales you use if you're improvising over jazz standards, and you can check that out. There's a link to it in the description. A discussion that sometimes appears at this point is what type of scale system should I use? And there are quite a few because you have caged 3 notes per string and the Berklee system. And this can sometimes lead to heated discussions. But in the end, it doesn't really matter what you use. Just go with what feels more natural to you, and you can always change along the way because they're more similar than they're different. How do you get started? The first thing to practice is just the basic scale. For example, this position of C major. Play it slowly, evenly with alternate picking. Connect the notes, because otherwise you're going to sound choppy when you start playing faster. You also want to be aware of the notes you play, so start on the root and then try to think along in the scale so that you know what you're playing. The first technical exercise that you want to do beyond just the basic scale is to play it in thirds. The reason for that is that when you play jazz, then you are using the notes of the chord, the arpeggios. And chords and arpeggios are built by stacking thirds. So by doing this exercise, you're preparing yourself technically to play arpeggios for 7th chords and triads. What do you need to play jazz phrases? Let's take a look at these fairly basic jazz lines. You can see that here I'm using a C major 7 arpeggio and some chromaticism mixed in with the scale notes. Now, beyond practicing the scale itself, then the things you want to practice are the things that you need in your solos. And arpeggios seems like a very useful candidate to begin with. When I was first taught arpeggios, then I was told to practice them as separate positions. In that way, you learn them as independent things and you're not really connecting them to the scales and the other things that you use when you're playing. A few years later, when I was in a Barry Harris masterclass in The Hague, I learned from Barry Harris that I should know how to play the diatonic arpeggios or the scales, and he talked about how to use them. If you practice the arpeggios like that, then you get an exercise like this. If you know how to play that exercise, then you have material that you can use on a lot of different chords that you come across in the key of C major. And you use these arpeggios together with the other notes that you have available in your solo. So everything is already connected and you can start working with material like this. For me, this was really a game changer. When you connect the arpeggio to the scale like that, it's much easier to play the arpeggio with an extra scale note and also see how the notes move from one chord to the next, which makes it a lot easier to make strong melodies that outline the chords. But there's a lot more you can get out of it, as you will see later in this video. You can practice the arpeggios from each note of the scale like this. And again, you want to play them cleanly, equal in volume, not too fast, and connecting the notes as much as possible. Another way of practicing that is useful is to practice up one and then down the next. And actually this exercise is a little bit easier because you don't have that large interval skip from one arpeggio to the next. In general, you want to practice different things to build your flexibility and work towards being free when you improvise. So coming up with variations and different ways of practicing them is definitely something you want to explore. There are many ways that you can use these arpeggios. To get started, it makes sense to just play the arpeggios on the chord progression. To turn this into something that you can use in a solo, then you can use the notes around the arpeggios and add some nice rhythms as well. For the D minor 7, then we have this arpeggio. And you can turn that into a more interesting line by adding the E in between the first two notes. In this way, you can start working on making lines like this. Another obvious candidate to check out would be the triads, and that's because we can easily connect some triads to the chords that we're improvising over, and you can make super strong melodies using those triads. Taking the triads to the scale would sound something like this. And of course you want to play this exercise not too fast, connecting the notes, making everything clear and keeping it in time. Let's look at how easy it is to find some triads for the chords that we're improvising over. If you look at D minor 7, then we have D, F, A and C. Here we already have two triads because we have a D minor triad and an F major triad. For the G7, G, B, D and F, we have a G major triad and a B diminished triad. And similar for C major 7, we have C major and E minor. And you can create some really great lines using the triads. An example of that could sound something like this. Here I'm using the F major triad on the D minor 7 chord, and I'm also using the E minor triad on the C major 7. Another important part of learning how to play jazz is learning how to improvise strong natural melodies on top of chord changes. And if you check out this video, then you get some strategies and suggestions on how you can develop that skill and practice that in your own playing and start sounding like a jazz guitarist.